Kishore Mehbubani, from an Indian point of view, you always come across slightly leaning on the Chinese side. If this was a diplomatic boxing bout, virtually, could you build on what you just heard from Ian and Samir? And would you too concede it's Modi 1, Xi 0, India 1, China 0, just at this moment?
Well, I think the first point I want to emphasize is that economic growth is not a zero-sum game. It's not like playing in a military game,
Sure,
which is a zero-sum game. Economic growth is not. So if India grows, China grows, US grows, it's a positive sum game. But at the same time, I think it's important, as Ian was suggesting, don't judge a boxing match on one weekend or one round. Let me give you my successor is Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, was Professor Denny Kwa, a well-known economist. And he just tweeted this figure. He said that if India grows every year at 2% faster than China, every year 2% faster than China, it will take India 85 years to catch up with China. So, let's be realistic at the end of the day about the economic weight of countries. And, and at the end of the day, I think let's forget the zero-sum games and talk about the positive effects. Because what India has done, it has created the G20 as a positive launching pad for the Global South. And it actually strengthens Brazil for its next meeting, because now that you have the African Union as a permanent member of the G20, it changes the chemistry of the G20 significantly, because the voice of the Global South is represented much more. And that's not a loss, by the way, not necessarily a loss for the United States, and not a loss for China. And the BRI, by the way, all I ask you to do is, in next month, China will be having a BRI summit in Beijing. Ask yourself a simple question. There are 193 countries in the world. Italy has left the BRI. How many countries will come to participate in the BRI meeting in China? You focus on the one that is leaving, or the 140 that are coming. So, these are realities you cannot erase.
well,
I'm not being pro-China. I'm just giving you data that points out the fact that India's role in the world is growing, China's role in the world is growing, and frankly, the role of the Global South is growing, and that's what we should be celebrating.
Rahul, can I quickly comment?
Sure, but Italy was the one country in Europe which was a part of the BRI. They're pulling out. So that's just not just one country. That's a very important country, because they could have brought others into the fold, and they instead are choosing to go out. So I have lots of questions, but Samir wants to make a quick interjection. So Samir Saran, go for it.
Quick point. I think broadly, I think Kishore would perhaps be correct in many assessments. But let me just tell you that numbers don't work that way. In the next 14 to 15 years, if India is going to be 18, 17 or 18 or 19 trillion dollars, it would not mean that the Chinese would have moved from where they are today. The whole basis of countries catching up is that at some point you start stagnating. And the big China question is that have they reached that point where they are now plateauing and stagnating? We have seen Japan and many others experience this for decades, this stagnation. So 85 years, I think, maybe pushing it too far. I would certainly agree with Ian and others if we were to talk about a decade and a half, the time where the difference would be significantly reduced, or rather would be insignificant in its implications. So that's one part. But second point, very quickly, again, it's not about the 140 or 130 who arrive at Emperor Xi's court. Who are they? And that is important. And the minute many of them have an alternative to the BRI, which was not available till now, many of them will not come to the court. They went to the court because the Chinese were the only game in town. They were the only ones who were investing in the infrastructure and other industrial aspirations of developing countries. My whole point that I made in my opening remarks was that if rich countries with partners like Brazil, India, and others, if we can reach out and if we can build the futures of those who seek a better life, BRI will have competition. BRI is the only game in town. Even if it is a bad one, people are playing it. Get better ones on the board and you will see many desert the BRI. That's the point I'm making, Rahul.
So you've said a couple of things, and I want to build on the question of what happens in China next. Okay, go for it. I like this. It's sounding like a good verbal joust. So go for it, Kishore Prabhupada. Yeah, go for it. Go.
No, I don't disagree with the points that Samir has made. But at the end of the day, he may be right that China's growth has plateaued, and India will therefore catch up much faster. But I have over the last 30 years been watching China. I have heard about the death of China every decade. Unfortunately, decade after decade, all the people who predict the growth of that the growth of China has ended have failed in their predictions, and so we'll find out. In any case, we'll find out. This year is 2023. We'll find out in 2033 whether or not China's growth has plateaued. And I always believe that you don't plan again, your best case scenarios that China has collapsed. You plan against the worst case scenarios that China may be growing very fast again. And on the question of Italy, let me give you one statistic that was, we are still so obsessed with the Europeans. Italy, frankly, Italy's economy is declining. And over the last, let me ask you a simple question. The European Union has a $17 trillion GNP. ASEAN, where I come from, Southeast Asia, has a $3 trillion GNP. From the years 2010 to 2020, who added more to global economic growth? Was it the European Union or was it ASEAN?
I got to jump in here.
ASEAN added more to global economic growth than the European Union. So why are we so fixated on the Europeans?
I got to jump in.
Let me put that question to Ian Bremmer, because I spoke to Dr. Geeta Gopinath just a couple of hours before we did this recording, and she said that China will continue to grow. One is the aspect of stagnation, the other is the concern about decline. Far from the IMF's current assessment seems to be that China, despite what's happening with debt, despite what's happening in the real estate sector, will continue to grow. So Ian Bremmer, where do you come out on the question of stagnation, decline, or continuing growth?
Look, I think that I agree with Kishore that it's too early to talk about things like peak China and stagnation. That seems to be an ideologically freighted, sort of discussion that's mostly had by people that really want China to fall apart. It's too early to make that assessment. But Italy matters. Italy matters a lot. And you saw how excited and how proud the Chinese were when the Italians said that they were going to join BRI. Why? Because it was the first G7 country to do so. It's a part of Europe. It meant that the Chinese were having success in ensuring that the Europeans weren't just going to be pro-US, but we're going to balance between the Americans and the Chinese would do both. The Chinese wouldn't be contained. They wouldn't be ganged up on. We saw the same thing with the Chinese and the 16+1, which then expanded. The East Europeans, the South Europeans, which became much weaker and fell apart when the Chinese were supporting Russia right before the invasion of Ukraine. So the Europeans as a whole are looking much more aligned with the United States on China. Ursula von der Leyen talking about de-risking as opposed to decoupling, the exact same formulation that Biden has. Why? Because they both formulated it together. So that's why Italy is so important for China, not because the Italian economy or because the Italian prime minister matters, because it's symptomatic of a bigger problem that the Chinese are presently experiencing, some of which is their own fault, some of which is politicized from the West. Now, I think that the exciting thing here is not whether or not China falls apart. In the same way that people have been saying that China is going to collapse for decades, people have been talking about the coming Chinese century for decades now, too. And that's gone. What we are seeing with the BRICS, with the G7, and most importantly with the G20 is a recognition that no country is going to own the 21st century. We have global challenges like pandemics, like climate change, like disruptive technologies, like the absence of adequate development finance and the challenges of globalization. And in order to address those challenges, it must be done multilaterally. It must be done globally. The Americans, the Chinese, the Indians, the Japanese, the EU must participate, and the African Union needs to be a part of the conversation. And the G20 imperfectly, nonetheless, represents a significant positive step in the recognition of that. This is not a win primarily for India or the US. It's not a loss primarily for China. It is rather a step on the road to recognizing that 10 billion people on this planet by 2100 are only going to succeed if the G20 as an organization becomes more successful.
Let Kishore Mehbubani respond to that. The idea that Emperor Xi would somehow lead China to its glorious past, where it would be the most important country in the world, where the world would revolve around the Chinese pole, that this would somehow be the Chinese century. Ian Bremmer articulating that this G20 and the existence of the G20 suggests that no such thing is going to happen. There is no Chinese century. Yes, of course, China is important, make no mistake, as is the United States, as is India, the European Union, the African Union, all of them together. So Emperor Xi needs to give up the idea of this somehow being then the Chinese century. Kishore Mehbubani.
Yes, first, let me agree with Ian Bremmer before I disagree with Ian Bremmer. Both he and Samir are friends of mine. I agree with Ian Bremmer that at the end of the day, the 10 billion people on planet Earth in the year 2100 are going to ask themselves the simple question whether the G20 prepared humanity and dealt with the major global challenges we face. No, the common global challenges we face, whether it's climate change, pandemics, global financial crisis, terrorism, whatever it is. I think that's what we should focus on. I agree with Ian. At the end of the day, forget who wins, who loses in G20. What's more important is the G20 addressing the common concerns of humanity. And I strongly endorse what Ian said, that we should come together and deal with the common challenges that humanity is facing. 8 billion of us now, 10 billion in 2100. Now, on the question of the Chinese century, I've never ever said that the 21st century will be the Chinese century. My book, The Asian 21st Century, which has been downloaded 3.24 million times over in 160 countries around the world, says that the 21st century will be the Asian century. And the Asians, by the way, still make up 55% of the world's population, 4.5 billion out of 8 billion. And by the way, India is very, very much a big part of the story of the Asian century. And indeed, as Angus Maddison, a British historian, pointed out, that from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 out of the last 2,000 years, the two largest economies of the world were always those of India and China. So what we're seeing is the natural return of India and China. And by the way, including ASEAN. I mean, the ASEAN is the most underrated organization in the whole world. And you're creating a new growth triangle, the new CIA growth triangle, not the Central Intelligence Agency, but China, India, ASEAN. And these 3.5 billion people in China, India, ASEAN are going to drive global economic growth for the next 100 years. Take my word for it.